Story 1. Driving through the desert at night can feel like stepping into another world, a world where you're completely alone. I've been a truck driver for 15 years, and most nights the silence and emptiness of the open road don't bother me. But in 2017, on a quiet stretch of highway cutting through the Mojave Desert, I experienced something that still haunts me. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt thicker than usual. There were no other cars, no streetlights, and no noise except the low hum of my truck's engine. My headlights were dim, something I'd been meaning to fix for months, but I kept driving. I was tired, the kind of tired that makes you question your judgment. Stopping wasn't an option. I needed the money, and pulling over meant wasting time I couldn't afford to lose. The road was straight, so I convinced myself it was safe to push through. After all, I'd driven this route dozens of times. But something about this night felt different, like the desert itself was watching. Little did I know I wasn't the only one out there. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, a black ribbon cutting through the heart of the desert. The truck's engine hummed steadily, but every so often I had to strain my eyes to see beyond the weak glow of my headlights. The Mojave Desert has a way of making you feel small, like you're the only person left on Earth. There were no lights, no signs of life, just me, my truck, and the road. The silence was unnerving. Normally I'd welcome the peace, but this felt different. Even the wind seemed to have taken the night off. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath for something I wasn't prepared for. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Still a few hours until sunrise. The thought of pulling over crossed my mind again, but I shook it off. I didn't want to lose any time. Besides, what could really go wrong? It was just me out here. At least that's what I thought. As I drove, my mind began to wander. I started thinking about the deliveries ahead, the long hours I'd have to push through, and how much easier this job would be if I didn't have to deal with nights like this. Then, out of nowhere, something appeared in the distance. At first it was just a faint flicker of light, but as I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was a car. Its hazard lights blinked slowly, casting an eerie glow in the middle of the road. The car sat perfectly still, its hazard lights pulsing in the darkness like a faint heartbeat. It wasn't pulled over to the side of the road, it was parked directly in the center, straddling the double yellow lines. I slowed my truck down, squinting to make out more details. As I got closer, I saw the passenger door was wide open, swinging slightly in the still air. A chill crept down my spine. There was no movement, no one waving for help. No sound except for the faint clicking of the hazard lights. My first thought was that someone might have broken down or been in an accident, but something about the scene didn't feel right. I didn't see any skid marks, no signs of a crash, nothing to explain why the car was there. I brought my truck to a stop just a few feet away from the vehicle, my headlights now illuminating its sleek red body. It was a new Ford Fusion, clean and polished, like it had just rolled off the lot. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel. My instincts told me to keep driving, to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out. Maybe someone needed help. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the desert air warm against my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the car's hazard lights. As I approached, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I peeked inside the car. The interior was spotless, no clutter, no bags, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. The key was still in the ignition, but the engine was off. I checked the back seat, ducking my head to make sure no one was hiding. Nothing. The car was completely empty. That's when the unease turned into something heavier. I glanced around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The beam of my flashlight cut through the night, but it didn't reach far enough to make me feel safe. I felt like I was being watched, but from where I couldn't tell. The trunk caught my attention next. It was shut tight, but something about it seemed off. It looked like it had been tied down with a rope. My heart started to pound. What could possibly be inside? Against my better judgment, I decided to take a closer look. I stood there for a moment, staring at the trunk, debating whether I really wanted to know what was inside. My hands trembled as I reached for the key in the ignition. As I unlocked the trunk, it didn't pop open like I expected. It was stuck, jammed as if something inside was pressing against it. I tried again, this time tugging at the rope that had been used to tie it shut. My gut was screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't walk away without knowing. I crouched down to inspect the edges of the trunk, trying to find a way to pry it open. That's when it happened. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the desert, shattering the silence. The sound was so loud, it felt like it came from right next to me. My head shot up and I instinctively ducked, slamming it against the roof of the car. Pain shot through my skull, but I didn't care. My body was in full panic mode. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight dropping to the ground. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, desperate to find the source of the shot. That's when I saw him. A man was standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, his figure barely visible. He was short and stocky, with messy red hair and wearing overalls that looked stained and worn. In his left hand he held a small shovel, in his right a hunting rifle. He didn't yell at me right away, he just stood there, staring. My breathing was ragged as we locked eyes. I expected him to look furious or deranged, but instead he looked worried. Then he yelled, his voice rough and gravelly. "Hey, wait!" he shouted, his tone desperate. He started moving toward me, but I wasn't waiting to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran back to my truck as fast as I could, my heart pounding harder with every step. As I climbed into the cab, I could hear him yelling again, closer this time. "Hey, stop!" he cried, his voice cutting through the darkness. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the truck would start quickly. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life, and I slammed it into gear. As I pulled away, my headlights illuminated the man one last time. He stood by the car, dropping his shovel and waving both arms in the air. For a split second, I thought he was trying to warn me about something, but then I saw his rifle glint in the light, and I knew I couldn't trust him. I didn't look back. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor and sped into the night, leaving him and his car behind. Or so I thought. The truck roared down the dark highway, and for a moment, I thought I was in the clear. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was nowhere to be seen, and his car was just a speck in the distance, swallowed by the desert night. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in the mirror. At first I thought it might be another vehicle passing through the empty stretch of road, but my gut told me otherwise. The lights were coming fast, far too fast. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. It was him. The red car closed the gap in seconds, its bright beams glaring into my mirror. The horn blared loudly, the sound cutting through the night like a warning. He wasn't just following me, he was chasing me. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing my semi harder than I ever had. The engine groaned under the strain, but I didn't care. My only thought was to get away. The red car swerved wildly behind me, its headlights dancing erratically in my mirrors. Then it got worse. He pulled up alongside me, dangerously close, as if he was trying to force me off the road. His horn blasted again, and I could see him through his open window, yelling something I couldn't make out over the noise of the engines. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911 while trying to keep the truck steady. My hand shook as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, barely able to form coherent sentences. All the while, the red car continued its assault, swerving in front of me and slamming on its brakes. I had no choice but to slow down, my truck screeching as I tried to avoid rear-ending him. He was relentless, pulling ahead only to cut me off again, forcing me to swerve dangerously close to the edge of the road. Minutes felt like hours as the chase continued. My heart pounded in my chest, each second filled with dread. I was certain he was trying to trap me, to force me to stop, but I couldn't let that happen. I refused to find out what he had planned if he succeeded. Finally, just as I thought I couldn't hold out any longer, Flashing blue and red lights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded my body as the headlights of a police car cut through the darkness. The red car hesitated for a moment, its brake lights flashing, before veering off the road and speeding into the desert. I pulled over, my body trembling as I climbed out of the truck. When the officer approached, I frantically explained everything that had happened, but instead of chasing after the red car, he just nodded, took down my report, and told me backup would arrive soon to search the area. As I watched the officer walk back to his car, frustration bubbled up inside me. The man was out there, somewhere in the desert, and I had no doubt he'd try this again with someone else. But for now, I was safe, or at least as safe as I could be after a night like that. As the officer finished taking my statement, he assured me they'd do a thorough search of the area once backup arrived. His calm demeanor didn't match the terror still coursing through my body. I wanted to yell at him, to demand they go after the man right then and there, but I was too shaken to argue. He handed me a card with the department's contact information and told me they'd call if they found anything. Then, just like that, I was sent on my way. I climbed back into my truck, my hands still trembling as I gripped the wheel. The adrenaline from the chase was wearing off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion that weighed me down. As I drove toward my destination, my mind raced with unanswered questions. What was in the trunk of that car? Why was it tied shut? And why had that man gone to such lengths to stop me? I tried to make sense of it, but every scenario I came up with was worse than the last. Some of my trucking buddies later joked that he was probably burying something or someone. They said the small shovel in the bags meant he had something to hide. But I didn't want to believe it. For my own sanity, I told myself it was something harmless, like an animal he couldn't let go of or supplies he didn't want anyone to find. Even now, years later, I still replay that night in my head. I'll never forget the sound of that gunshot or the look on the man's face as he stood in the beam of my headlights. He didn't look crazy, but he also didn't look innocent. I don't know what his intentions were, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that since that night, I've never felt comfortable driving through the desert alone. The silence that used to be peaceful now feels suffocating, and every shadow on the road feels like a warning. Some things are better left unexplained, but that doesn't stop them from haunting you. Story 2. There's a reason truckers don't stop in the middle of nowhere at night. That night in the forest, I learned why. I'd been on the road for hours, pushing through the exhaustion that comes with long hauls. It was a quiet, lonely stretch of highway, cutting through endless miles of dense forest. The trees stood tall on either side, their shadows stretching across the road under the faint glow of my headlights. It was the kind of silence that makes you uncomfortable, the kind that makes every little sound feel louder. I'd been hired to make a delivery by morning, and the deadline was tight. Stopping wasn't part of the plan, even though I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I told myself I could handle it. After all, it was just another night on the road. But as I drove deeper into the woods, that familiar comfort of routine started to fade. Something about the darkness here felt heavier, like the forest was closing in around me. I kept glancing at the clock, counting the hours until sunrise. The thought of seeing the light of day felt like a distant relief. I didn't know it yet, but the night was about to take a turn I'd never forget. The kind of turn that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about staying safe on the road. The road seemed endless, a narrow strip of asphalt swallowed by towering trees on both sides. My truck's headlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing just enough of the road to keep moving. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant chirp of a cricket. Just the hum of my engine and the faint creak of my seat as I adjusted my grip on the wheel. I glanced at the fuel gauge and then at the clock. A few more hours to go, I thought. My delivery was important, and stopping wasn't an option. I leaned forward, trying to shake off the sleep creeping up on me. The last thing I needed was to nod off on this empty road. That's when I saw it. something lying in the middle of the road up ahead. At first I thought it was debris, maybe a branch that had fallen from the trees, but as I got closer, my brow furrowed. It wasn't a branch. It was a dress, a purple dress, neatly laid out in the center of the lane. My foot instinctively eased off the gas and my hands tightened on the wheel. I slowed the truck, staring at the dress as my headlights washed over it. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. I couldn't figure out why, but my stomach started to churn with unease. I told myself it was nothing, a random piece of trash someone must have dropped. But just as I was about to press on, something else appeared further down the road. Shoes. A pair of small, neatly placed shoes. My heartbeat quickened. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was very, very wrong. My gut told me to keep driving, to ignore it. But curiosity has a way of overriding fear. Against my better judgment, I slowed the truck even more and decided to take a closer look. I brought the truck to a stop, the engine rumbling softly as I sat there, staring at the strange scene in front of me. The purple dress lay perfectly still in the center of the road, as if someone had carefully placed it there. A little further ahead, the small shoes sat side by side, eerily tidy. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to ignore it and drive away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. What if someone needed help? What if this wasn't just some strange coincidence? Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The cold night air hit me immediately, sharper than I expected. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked toward the dress, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Up close, the dress looked clean, almost new. No dirt, no tears, just a vivid purple fabric lying on the road. My stomach churned as I moved past it, my light sweeping over the surrounding area. Then I saw it, more clothing scattered along the road ahead. A few yards beyond the shoes was another pile, a child's shirt, a pair of pants, and a small jacket. It looked like someone had just dropped them there, one by one, leading deeper into the darkness. My flashlight flicked toward the edge of the road, scanning the thick line of trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. The silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My gut twisted tighter. Something about this didn't feel right. I glanced back at the truck, the cab glowing faintly in the distance, a safe haven that suddenly felt too far away. Just as I was about to head back, the sound cut through the stillness. A scream, high-pitched and piercing, like a child in pain. It echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then, seconds later, another scream. This time, it came from the opposite direction, identical to the first, but impossibly far apart. My pulse raced as I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly into the trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows. Fear gripped me as I stood there, rooted to the spot. The screams were wrong, too perfect, too calculated. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. My breathing grew shallow as I stood there, frozen, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The second scream still echoed faintly in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The woods seemed alive now, shifting and moving in the edges of my vision. I took a step back, then another, my eyes darting between the trees. That's when I saw it. Movement. Quick and subtle, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. A shadow darting between the trees, too fast to make out clearly. Then another. My heart pounded in my chest as more figures began to appear, weaving between the trunks, staying just out of reach of the light. I tried to steady the beam, sweeping it across the forest. That's when I saw it. A person, partially hidden behind a tree. They were holding something large and rectangular, glowing faintly in the darkness. My mind raced as I focused on the object, and then it hit me. A speaker. The screams weren't real. Someone was playing them through the speaker, trying to lure me into the woods. My stomach churned at the realization, fear mixing with anger. What kind of sick game was this? Before I could react, a loud thump echoed from behind me, snapping my attention back to the truck. Something had hit the side of the cab. I spun around, my flashlight catching nothing but the faint outline of my vehicle. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I took a cautious step toward it. Another sound, this time from the opposite side of the truck. A quick shuffle, followed by the crunch of gravel. My heart raced as I realized they were circling me, staying in the shadows, out of reach. Adrenaline took over. I turned and sprinted back toward the truck, my boots slamming against the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the pavement, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I reached the cab and threw the door open, climbing inside and slamming it shut behind me. Just as I fumbled for the ignition, another loud crash came from the passenger side window. A heavy object smashed into the glass, cracking it but not breaking through. My hands shook as I turned the key, praying the engine would start. The truck roared to life and I slammed it into gear, pressing the accelerator to the floor. My headlights cut through the darkness as the truck lurched forward, but not before I caught a glimpse in the mirror, one of the figures stepping out of the woods, holding something long and sharp. They watched as I sped away, disappearing into the night. My only thought was to get as far away from that place as possible. The truck roared down the road, the engine straining under my frantic push on the accelerator. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, and my eyes darted between the windshield and the mirrors. The cracked passenger side window vibrated with every bump in the road, a constant reminder of how close I'd been to something terrible. I thought I was in the clear, that I had escaped whatever was lurking in those woods. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the side mirror. My heart sank as I saw them, a group of figures emerging from the shadows, sprinting toward the road. One of them reached the shoulder and hurled something, a rock or a piece of debris, at the truck. It hit the rear of the trailer with a loud clang, making me flinch. I didn't slow down. If anything, I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put more distance between us. But the figures didn't give up. In the faint glow of my tail lights, I saw two of them climbing into an old, battered pickup truck parked just off the road. Its headlights flared to life, and the engine roared as they pulled onto the highway behind me. My stomach twisted as the pickup accelerated, closing the gap between us. The truck swerved wildly, its driver honking the horn repeatedly. I could see the silhouette of someone in the passenger seat, leaning out the window, waving something metallic, possibly a crowbar or a pipe. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't just trying to scare me. They wanted me to stop. I had no intention of finding out why. The pickup pulled up alongside my truck, dangerously close, and the passenger leaned out further, swinging the object toward my cab. I swerved, narrowly avoiding the blow, but the trailer wobbled dangerously behind me. I had to keep control or risk flipping the whole rig. They swerved again, this time cutting in front of me, forcing me to slow down. My truck screeched as I hit the brakes, the sound tearing through the night. They were trying to trap me, to box me in. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with one hand while steering with the other. The pickup sped ahead, then slammed on its brakes, forcing me to veer off to the side. Gravel sprayed from my tires as I struggled to stay on the road. I shouted into the phone, barely able to get the words out, telling the operator what was happening. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded my chest as the pickup hesitated, its brake lights flaring. They turned sharply, veering off the road and disappearing into the trees. I didn't stop until I was safely parked next to the police car. My body shook as I climbed out of the cab and explained everything to the officer. My voice wavered as I described the clothing, the screams, the figures, and the pickup truck. The officer nodded, his face serious but calm. "We'll send a team to investigate," he said, taking notes. "You're lucky you got out of there." Lucky. That word echoed in my mind as I sat back in my truck, staring at the cracked window in the distant dark forest. Whatever they were planning, I didn't want to think about how close I'd come to finding out. I stayed parked next to the police car for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would somehow make me vulnerable again. The officer assured me they'd investigate the area and search for the pickup truck, but his calm tone didn't ease the knot in my stomach. When he finally sent me on my way, the relief of escaping the situation was overshadowed by the lingering fear of what could have happened. As I drove away, the road ahead seemed endless, but at least it felt safer now that I was out of those woods. My mind replayed the night over and over, the dress, the shoes, the screams, and those shadowy figures with the speaker. It all felt like some sick, calculated trap, designed to lure someone like me into the trees. But why? What were they planning to do? I thought about the people in the pickup truck, their frantic attempts to stop me. What if they'd succeeded? My heart raced just imagining it. My truck's cab had been my only shield, my only escape. If I had hesitated for even a moment, I might not have made it out. By the time I reached the nearest rest stop, my body felt heavy with exhaustion and tension. I parked under the brightest light I could find and locked the doors before leaning back in my seat. I wanted to sleep, but every creak of the truck and every shadow in the corner of my eye kept me wide awake. I called the police the next day, hoping for an update. They said they'd searched the area but hadn't found anything. No clothing, no speaker, no pickup truck. It was as if the entire scene had vanished. The lack of answers didn't bring me any peace. Instead, it left me with more questions, questions I knew would never be answered. Even now, years later, I can still hear those screams in the back of my mind. They weren't real, but they felt real enough to terrify me. And those people, they were real. Whatever they were trying to do, I'll never know. I haven't driven through that stretch of woods again, and I don't plan to. If I've learned one thing, it's this: never stop in the middle of nowhere, no matter how strange or desperate something looks. Because sometimes the moment you step out, you're exactly where they want you to be. Story 3. Sometimes it's not the road ahead you need to worry about, it's the places you stop along the way. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, the kind of stretch where the road feels endless and the silence presses in like a weight. It was late and I'd been behind the wheel for hours, my body heavy with exhaustion. My eyes burned from staring at the dark highway, and every mile seemed longer than the last. I knew I was pushing my limits, but I had a delivery to make, and stopping wasn't part of the plan. That was until I realized my stash of energy drinks was empty. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd forgotten to restock during my last stop. With hours left to drive and sleep creeping up on me, I had no choice. I needed to find something to keep me awake. The GPS showed a service stop not far ahead, and relief washed over me. But when I pulled in, it wasn't what I expected. The place looked deserted, its flickering sign barely visible in the dark. The gas pumps were old and rusted, and the convenience store stood there like a relic from another time. My stomach tightened with unease, but I convinced myself it was fine. I just needed one drink. That's all. I had no idea what was waiting for me inside. The truck's engine rumbled softly as I parked in front of the store. The building looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The windows were clouded with dirt, and the faint light from a single bulb above the door barely illuminated the entrance. Everything about it felt off. Too quiet. Too still. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to keep driving, but my body begged for energy. I convinced myself it was just an old store, nothing to worry about. After all, I'd been in plenty of run-down places before. I climbed out of the cab, the air cold against my face, and made my way toward the entrance. The wooden steps creaked under my boots, and as I pushed the door open, it let out a long, low groan. Inside, It was pitch dark. The smell of damp wood and stale air hit me immediately. I stepped in slowly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Shelves lined the walls, but they were empty, covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like the place had been abandoned for years. I took a deep breath, telling myself to grab what I needed and leave. That's when I noticed it, a faint bluish glow coming from a room in the back. It was the only light in the store, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. My instincts told me to turn around and walk out, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what it was. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the store, the glow growing brighter with each step. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I kept going. As I moved closer to the back room, the glow became clearer, spilling out through a half-open door. My heartbeat quickened, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker now, colder, as if the light was pulling the warmth out of the room. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above it. I pushed it open slowly, and the glow spilled over me, bathing the room in an eerie blue light. In the center of the room was a refrigerator. It looked out of place, newer than anything else in the store, its white surface clean and free of dust. The fridge was plugged into the wall, the cord snaking along the floor to an outlet that seemed impossibly functional in this decaying building. Its light flickered faintly, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. I stepped closer, drawn to it without really understanding why. I opened the door, the cold air hitting me immediately. Inside, the fridge was completely empty. No shelves, no food, nothing. Just an empty, hollow space that didn't make sense. Why was it here? Who had plugged it in? As I stood there, staring into the glow, a soft sound broke the silence. A faint clatter, like something small hitting the floor, came from the main room of the store. My body stiffened, and I whipped my head around, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. The silence was deafening now, pressing against my ears like a weight. I stepped back into the main room, scanning the area with my eyes. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease in my gut grew stronger. That's when I noticed the door. The front door, the one I was sure I had closed behind me, was now wide open. My stomach dropped as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was here with me. The open door sent a jolt of fear through me. I stared at it, the faint light from outside spilling onto the dusty floor. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone followed me in? Was I imagining things? My gut screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The store was silent again. Too silent, like the kind of quiet that isn't natural. My eyes darted around, scanning every shadow, every corner for any sign of movement. Nothing. The shelves, the counters, everything looked exactly as it had when I walked in. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I slowly backed toward the fridge, instinctively thinking its light might give me some sense of safety. That's when I heard it again, a faint shuffling sound, almost like footsteps. My head snapped toward the noise, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. The sound stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Then I saw it. Movement. A shadow passed between two rows of shelves, just barely visible in the faint glow of the refrigerator. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't my imagination. Someone was here. I tried to think rationally, tried to convince myself it was just a drifter or a squatter, but deep down I knew this wasn't normal. The way the shadow moved, slow and deliberate, as if it was waiting for something. It didn't feel right. I took another step back, bumping into the fridge. The light flickered slightly, casting strange shapes on the walls. The shuffling noise returned, louder this time, coming from the direction of the front door. I turned toward it, my pulse racing, but I saw nothing. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from behind me back in the fridge room. I spun around, my body shaking as I peered into the light. The door of the fridge was wide open, the light inside flickering wildly. But the room was empty. The air felt colder now, almost freezing, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. I turned toward the exit, my steps quickening, but the shuffling sound followed me. It was closer now, coming from just behind the shelves. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I sprinted toward the door, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. As I reached the entrance, I felt it. The undeniable sensation of something watching me, something waiting in the darkness. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting back to the safety of my truck. I burst through the open door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My boots pounded against the wooden steps as I sprinted toward my truck, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move faster. I fumbled with the door handle, throwing it open and scrambling into the cab. Just as I slammed the door shut, a loud thud echoed from the side of the truck. My heart nearly stopped. Something, or someone, had thrown something against the metal. I locked the doors with trembling hands, my eyes darting between the mirrors, searching for movement. The faint glow of the store flickered behind me, the light from the fridge spilling through the dirty windows. But something else caught my attention. In the dim reflection of the truck's side mirror, I saw it. A figure, hunched and motionless, standing just outside the store's entrance. I couldn't make out its face or features, only the outline of its body. It stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. I turned the key in the ignition, the truck's engine sputtering to life. My shaking hands gripped the steering wheel as I threw it into gear. Just as the truck began to move, another loud bang came from the back of the trailer, followed by a scraping noise. I didn't wait to see what it was. My foot slammed on the accelerator, and the truck roared forward, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The store and its glowing light disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after me. But the road was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of trees. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. I drove for miles without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Finally, I spotted a brightly lit gas station up ahead, its neon sign a welcome sight. I pulled in, parking under the brightest light I could find, and locked the doors before taking a shaky breath. Whatever had been in that store, it wanted me to stay. And for a terrifying moment, I almost did. But I wasn't safe yet. Not completely. The memory of that shadowy figure outside the store and the sound of something hitting my truck stayed with me, refusing to fade. As I sat there in the safety of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that store hadn't given up. It was still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting. I stayed parked at the gas station for what felt like hours, the bright fluorescent lights above offering little comfort. My hands still shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through the events of the last hour. No matter how hard I tried to piece it together, nothing made sense. The glowing fridge, the open door, the shadowy figure, I couldn't explain any of it. Finally, I worked up the courage to call the police. My voice trembled as I told the dispatcher about the abandoned store, the strange noises, and the figure I'd seen. I mentioned the banging on my truck, my growing fear that someone, or something, had been following me. The dispatcher was calm, almost too calm, as if they didn't quite believe me. They assured me they'd send someone to check out the store, but I could tell this wasn't a priority for them. I didn't push it. I just wanted to get back on the road, as far away from that place as possible. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the local station to follow up. The officer on the other end sounded confused. "We checked the store," he said. It's been abandoned for years. There's no power, no fridge, nothing that matches what you described." My stomach turned as his words sank in. I knew what I'd seen. I hadn't imagined the glow, the sounds, or the figure, but the idea that there was no trace of it left behind made my skin crawl. Even now, the memory haunts me. I can still feel the cold air from that empty fridge and see the faint shadow of that figure in my mirror. Whatever was in that store, it wasn't normal, and it wanted me there for a reason. I've made hundreds of deliveries since that night, but I haven't taken a route near that stretch of road again. I don't think I ever will, because sometimes it's not what you find on the road that you need to worry about, it's the places you stop along the way.